Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul podcast with Robert Glasscock. I'm Thomas Miller. Robert is here, and we are going to talk about something that is in the moment of the release date of this episode, and that is the lunar total eclipse on May 16th, 2022. Robert, I have been looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this. I took a look at the chart and saw several things, and I know people have interpreted this one in a number of different ways. So tell us your take on this eclipse of May 16th, 2022.
Well, I will be happy to, but I just wanted to say thank you again for having me on. It's occurred to me, Thomas, that you are the only professional podcast host / producer that I know of who is also an excellent astrologer. And you're a perfect example of somebody for whom astrology is a secondary interest compared to your broadcasting career, for example, but who has learned to use astrology effectively in their own lives. And I mean, a good astrologer. I know this because you've participated in some of my workshops, but anybody really can tell this from the kinds of questions and probing that you do here. Anyway, that is why I look forward to these conversations with you.
Well, thank you so much for that. And coming from somebody whose first job at age 20 was working in the Pasadena Playhouse, which is something that is like, that's a tradition. I really appreciate those comments. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll tell you, this lunar eclipse, there are many, many ways to look at eclipses. One of them is just to look at the eclipse itself, regardless of locality. Now, what I do in this kind of situation is to set up the eclipse for Greenwich, England, which is where the clock is. But I put in the natural wheel. The natural wheel in astrology begins with 0 Aries on the first cusp and so on. So when you do that and you stick the eclipse planets in the natural wheel, what you're really looking at is an eclipse for the world.
And by the way, let me just interject here that we have the chart that Robert has constructed in the show notes. So if you'd like to see what he's looking at as he describes, just find the show notes for this episode. There you'll find the chart.
Oh, great, Thomas. That'll be helpful. So really, we're looking here at simply the transiting planets at the moment of an eclipse. Now, this is a lunar eclipse, which is an opposition of the sun and the moon. So the Earth, and eclipses only take place on or near the moon's nodes.
Would you explain why?
Yes, the moon's nodes are a very interesting point in astrology. They go way back to ancient Arabian astrologers. And they represent, the moon's nodes show where on the ecliptic, and the ecliptic is simply the plane of the sun's apparent motion in the sky, or the plane of the Earth's orbit around the sun, either way you want to look at it. The moon's orbit is tilted above and below that plane, so it intersects the plane of the ecliptic. The moon's orbit is inclined about 5 degrees and 8 minutes from the plane of the ecliptic. So during the moon's passage in the heavens, there are times where it goes below the ecliptic, and that's called the south node, the descending node. And there are times where the moon's orbit takes it above the ecliptic, and that point is called the north node. So that's the ascending node and the descending node. And then they have meanings, but that's the astronomy of it. So eclipses can only take place. This is a lunar eclipse where the Earth gets between the sun and the moon. So if you're on the line of the eclipse, you will see the moon will go red or go dark, which is simply the sunlight passing through the Earth's atmosphere and traveling on to the moon to be reflected back from the moon. So it appears orange or red. So it's a lunar eclipse is an opposition. A solar eclipse is a conjunction. So an eclipse is simply a snapshot at a particular moment in our solar system as seen from Earth that is made special by the eclipse, the lunar or solar eclipse. So eclipses are, I think of them as punctuation in a sentence, for example, an exclamation mark or maybe a period. A solar eclipse, which is where the sun and moon are conjunct each other, is a very powerful archetypal focus. It says, look at me, exclamation mark. Pay attention to me, exclamation mark. Something new is being born, exclamation mark. A lunar eclipse is an ending. Now, it's true in all of physical manifestation, every ending precedes a beginning. So that's why we metaphysicians say it all the time. It's a death and rebirth cycle. Something is ending and something is being born. And that's true here too. But the sense that a person or a nation or the world has under a lunar eclipse is primarily what is being lost, what's ending. Now, this is a lunar eclipse, which astrologically has a period of, maybe 6 months. The next one is in November. So it's a snapshot of space at a very particular astronomical point of emphasis, saying, pay attention to this. So a lunar eclipse, which we're having right now, takes place between the signs of Taurus and Scorpio. The signs and the constellations are two different things. And let me see if I can explain this in a nutshell. When astrology began, the vernal equinox took place in Aries, and forevermore, that seasonal relationship between the sun and the moon, between the sun and the earth, is called spring, and new life is born, and so on. So that's where the symbol is. Well, due to precession of the equinoxes, which is about a 26,000 year cycle, and for some reason, don't ask me how, but even the ancient, earliest astronomers were aware of this, and we know this because of their writings. The precession of the equinox, say the vernal equinox, takes about, 2,200 years to slowly go backwards through a particular sign. So the equinoctial points keep recessing backwards through the zodiac, so that today, in fact, at the vernal equinox, the sun isn't even in Aries, it's in Pisces. And it's about to slowly move into Aquarius, going backwards. So the signs, the original signs, were never truly some mystical power coming to Earth from this particular constellation in the zodiac. It was simply that the constellation was an easy way to mark and name each one of the seasons, to mark and name the various solar and earth relationships. So you have summer, spring, fall, winter, and everything in between. And so these signs and the archetypes, the collected associations that we all have with each sign arose from those seasonal relationships. And they were called, it's Taurus. We're now in Taurus. Well, in fact, the sun is not in the constellation of Taurus, but the seasonal relationship is the same. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the vernal equinox in an ice age or yesterday. It is still on Earth, which is where we live. It is still the vernal equinox from the standpoint of plants and animals in the Earth itself, regardless of what the constellation is behind the sun at the time. So I hope that's clear for those who are a little bit concerned about the difference between signs and constellations.
That's a key point, that it's 25,800 and some odd years. It's because the Earth's orbit is actually on a wobble. and that's why it's accounting for that wobble.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
it's kind of like if you had a flashlight up and you were or a laser thing that you were pointing up into the sky, hopefully not in an airplane, and your hand was shaking a little bit, way up there in the sky, you'd see a much bigger wobble. You'd see it up there, but you wouldn't see it down here. And that's kind of the same idea, is it's just projected out in time. And because the Earth's orbit is not precise, that's why we have to adjust.
Yeah. And it's also the axial tilt of the Earth as well. So, the great year, which is, what is it, around 26,000, 25,000 years, the great year is how long it takes for the equinoxes, for example, to pass all the way through all of the signs and return again. And it still astonishes me that these early astronomers and astrologers knew this. And of course, astronomy arose out of astrology, actually. We know this because, for example, we have an animal's femur bone, a leopard's bone, that was carved with the phases of the moon on it. It was carbon dated 12,500 years ago. So we know that that's how all of this started. Very primitive men, shepherds, guarding their flocks by night, studying the stars, the wanderers, the planets, began to make note of these strange objects in the sky, the gods, and correlating them with events on Earth and even events in the tribe, and noting them and orally telling them. And then as writing came to be, they would write them down. So that's how long we've been correlating these seasonal relationships of the sun, moon, and planets with the Earth with actual events. So an eclipse here, this lunar eclipse we're having right now, is simply an emphasis point. It says, look at this. So it's like a snapshot. And if you place that in the natural wheel, starting with 0 Aries, then you can read all of the planets in their sign archetypes. And one of the ways I think about these planets and signs and houses, Thomas, is planets are types of archetypal energy. Mars, for example, symbolizes action. It symbolizes anger. These are all archetypes. It symbolizes war. There's never been a time in human history where we didn't have war. It's an archetype. And it also exists even on much greater levels. When you see planets collide, that's Mars. That's that archetype, only on a much vaster level. So the planets are types of energies. Saturn's energy is to conserve and to build and to structure and to make permanent, and also to repress or suppress or to control. So Saturn's energy is of a particular kind. Each one of these planets, the moon, Venus, for example, has to do with attractiveness. So in fact, on a big planetary or stellar level, Venus is gravity. It's what attracts, or if it's in hard aspect, what repels. And the same is true in a human individual. It's what attracts you. It's what you love. It's the arts, beauty, and so on. So that's the Venus archetype. So each one of these archetypes, planets have energies. They're like players, and the signs that they are in are like scripts, stories. So that Mars in Virgo, Mars is still Mars, but it's acting in a Virgonian way. It's following a Virgonian script. And this is true in your natal chart too. So you've got the players. Well, we are merely players strutting our hour upon the stage. This is Shakespeare. You've got the planets, sun, moon, and planets as players, types of energies. You've got the stories, the scripts, which are the signs, and you've got the stage, the spheres of life, which are the houses. And that's it in a nutshell. So you can look at a natural wheel like this with 0 Aries rising, and you see immediately that, well, Jupiter is at 1 degree Aries today. That's a very hopeful eclipse. Now, the moon and the sun are opposite each other in Taurus and Scorpio, which happen to be associated with money, economies, and most of all, values. And the opposition in this natural wheel is from the second house, which also has to do with values and self-worth and money, economies. And it's opposite the moon in the eighth house, which is other people's money in the cookbook astrology. So this eclipse is very much about the world economy, for starters. But deeper than that, it's about every nation on earth going through a crisis in its value system. Who are we as Americans? Who are we as Russians? Who are we as Chinese? What do we really believe and value? What do we have to sell that other people will buy? How do we earn a living? Taurus is very much associated with food and the staples of life, shelter, and so on. So we're facing a crisis in sense of values all around the world. And that's just from this opposition. This opposition also forms a T-square with Saturn. So we have the sun today in Taurus opposite the moon in Scorpio, and both that opposition is squared by Saturn in Aquarius. So one of the ways you can look at that, because it's a T-square, which is always a sign of crisis and potential growth. And generally, squares are typically, they're hard aspects, which simply means that hard aspects demand action of some kinds because there is stress and frustration inherent in this kind of spatial relationship with a T-square. And people don't do anything unless they are stressed by something. Something isn't right and needs fixing, and therefore they'll fix it. And usually it takes a lot before people actually do take action. So this T-square in this eclipse chart is basically a world financial and economic crisis. And these archetypes and the story that we're telling has to do, for example, with Taurus, my money, Scorpio, other people's money. So it's how the world interacts with money. Look what has just happened with the ruble, for example, which is worthless at this point. And the Russian economy is on the verge of collapse. If you read the news that I try and read, and I try and get my hands on as objective news reports as I can. Second of all, Saturn here is in Aquarius, which traditionally in astrology is the sign of humanitarianism, of the world and all of its diversity, its rainbow colors, its different philosophies and religions. But the one thing that unites us is we are all human beings. And that's you hear the Aquarian age, the dawn of the Aquarian age. Well, it's here. Now, in fact, it doesn't happen astrologically for another 120 years or so, but we're moving into it. Aquarius, as you know, also happens to rule the internet and computers. It rules astrology. The internet has brought the world together in a way that is unique in human history. We have now Amazon tribesmen who have cell phones. So even the Amazon tribesman is able to look at a phone and get the news. This is unprecedented in human history. It used to take weeks, months for the news to travel around the world. Now it's instant. So what we have constructed technologically, the human race has evolved to create a literal global brain, just like the synapses in an individual brain. And that's what is challenging everybody and everything. And that's why political organizations want to control the internet, because it's information. So this is also bringing about a crisis. And what is now happening when you take this back to this eclipse, focusing on our values, everybody, every nation's, every person's values. What do I value? Who am I really? What do I really believe? What will I fight for to protect? All of those value systems have been under stress from information because our most dearly held myths about ourselves are being shattered by revelations. America is having to deal still, for example, with what it told itself about the Civil War. America is still having to deal with the Trail of Tears, what we did to indigenous Americans, indigenous people in this country. So we have all of these facts are coming to the surface. Anybody can Google anything and find out. And of course, now it behooves you to understand the sources for these information. Some sources are dependable, some are not. So our trust in what we've been told, and even our trust in government, is being challenged by facts. Now, I like this eclipse in a number of ways. For example, just what I was talking about, Neptune and lies, for example, or misinformation or disinformation. In this eclipse today, Mars and Neptune are conjunct in Pisces, which absolutely continues this trend of exposing lies and exposing corruption. And this is going on worldwide. It's not just here. We're seizing Russian oligarchs' yachts. Not we, America, but other countries, because they got them through corruption. This is one of the reasons why the Russian economy is collapsing, is because the 1% or even less percent of well-placed Russians have stolen all the money that should have gone to the military, which can't win this Ukraine war. Because of that, they have lousy equipment. These oligarchs have stolen all the money. Well, that's being seized. So these revelations about politics and world leaders, including our own here in America, these are jolting to people's dearly held value systems and belief systems, which of course are naturally fixed in the sense of astrology's cardinal, mutable, and fixed. Here we are talking about the sun in Taurus today, a fixed sign. So one's values, once they're established, which is generally in childhood, and they certainly can change and evolve, but our value systems, what we believe in, they stay fixed unless something really powerful comes along to shake them up. And then we'll change. And something else I think that's true for the human race, whether individual or collectively, nobody makes changes unless they hurt enough. It's got to hurt enough. But in this eclipse chart, one of the things I do like, if you think of the eclipse again as the sun-moon opposition, then Neptune trines one end of that, it trines the moon, and it sextiles the other end of that, the sun. And Mars and Neptune are conjunct, so that means Mars and Neptune both are in a trine sextile relationship to this eclipse, and that's really favorable. And what that symbolizes in Mars and Neptune in Pisces, Pisces and Neptune both have a lot to do with spirituality, not necessarily religion, which is a different thing. This trine sextile I'm talking about with Mars Neptune doesn't so much support religion as it supports spirituality, which is the direct connection that every living organism on Earth has with the all that is. It's there. And I think religions do a great disservice when they teach you that the only way you can be in contact with that is by following our stories and our dogmas. That's not true. Everybody has that inborn in them to be able to stay in touch, in contact with this greater all that is. So clearly in this one chart, you have the Saturn is in the 11th house, which is the collective, the group. So it's in a sense, it's America's, or it's the world's rather, not just America, it's the world's, the 11th house. The world's hope for its future is the 11th house. Hopes, dreams, and ambitions, if you go back to the cookbooks. This eclipse has Saturn in that house, which represses that, depresses that, and also focuses on it. So everywhere you go in the world under this eclipse is this sense that our future looks dire or frightening because Saturn is there. And the reason it looks dire or frightening is that so much that we have depended on and counted on and believed in is turning out to not be true, or it's turning out to be at the end of a cycle. And people go, well, what's going to replace that? So here we have the moon square Saturn and opposite the sun. That's very much about human rights, Aquarius, in a T-square with this sun and moon, which is men and women everywhere. So you're looking at the same struggles going on now. I just was reading 2 days ago about women in the Middle East, in Iran, I believe, refusing to wear the burqa. Excuse me, they could be killed for this. And they're refusing to do it. So it's these kinds of changes that are encroaching. And I'm also now looking at Pluto in this eclipse chart, Thomas. Pluto is at 28 degrees Capricorn. It's been in Capricorn for many years here, and but it's right at the end of Capricorn, and it's going to move into Aquarius. And the reason that that is significant is because Pluto in Capricorn refers to world governments, which are symbolized by Capricorn. The kings, the rulers, the dictators, the authorities, the governments, all of that is Capricorn. Pluto going through that sign has, quote unquote, transformed every government in the world over the last period of its stay in Capricorn. And it's about finished, Pluto's transit through Capricorn, which means when you look at Pluto of extremes, and it is the planet of death and rebirth, if you will, but on a very deep level, fundamental level, we can never go back, and the world can never go back to the kinds of governments that we have had. They're all dying and being reborn, including China and Russia and the United States and Europe. Pluto is also associated on other levels with, I hate to say, atomic energy. And with the current state of things, particularly in the Ukraine and with Putin and with Russia, there is always the potential for Putin to decide to use a tactical or even strategic nuclear weapon. Nothing else has worked in Ukraine. It's incredibly dangerous for him to do it. But there's as I said, nothing changes until it hurts enough. So this idea that world governments have been changing for the last, how many of them, 14, 15 years of Pluto through, it's about that period in humanity and in the world is coming to an end, and Pluto is going to ingress into Aquarius. Aquarius, among other things, is an explosive sign. It's ruled by Uranus, which is sudden, major, and explosive. The world can never go back. The world has never gone back since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when we dropped 2 atomic bombs. We can't go back. So this period is of world government. The old forms of government, especially the sense that war, the archetype of war gets us anywhere, that too is dying, because we are all interconnected. Look at what's happening with shipping around the world and getting products. We're so interconnected. You build a Ford, well, it's an American brand, except all the parts come from something like 36 different countries to build that Ford. So nobody is an island anymore. Can't be. So we're all connected, all interdependent. So this idea of deadly competition for power between tribes or nations, that is dying. And that too is terribly frightening for people, because that's how they're used to living. My nation, my church, my political party is better than yours. And what has to happen, and will be forced on us to happen, is to learn to cooperate and respect each other, even though we're completely different. We have to learn to live together on this planet. Pluto also sextiles the moon and trines the sun. So we got two configurations here that form sextiles and trines to the polarity of the sun-moon eclipse, the polarity of that opposition. And those are very hopeful, and they're very major. One of those planets is Pluto. The other one is Neptune, which happens to conjunct Mars here. Those are big collective archetypes. And the fact that Mars of war, the old god of war, is conjunct Neptune means that this metaphor of war as a means to living and surviving is also undergoing a big change. So people and nations too are having to face the fact war doesn't work anymore. Look at what's going on in the Ukraine. That stupid war has brought the economy in Russia to collapse. And it's exposed that army as being completely undersupplied, understaffed, incompetent because of the corruption in Russia. And don't think we're not corrupt here. Of course we are. And look at the role that munitions and war play in economies. Always a safe bet to invest in companies that make war machines so far. But if the war metaphor collapses, then what happens to the race to build better weapons? So this is just one little lunar eclipse, but look at the themes that it's already saying, hey, look at this. This is what's ending. And this is where you have hope. Now, that's a quick thumbnail discussion. Does this make any sense?
Yeah, we could have gone 5 hours. Wow, that was amazing. Thank you for such in-depth analysis of this. I did want to ask one thing here. On Saturn, you talked about Saturn in that T-square position. What about Saturn as a midpoint?
Mm-hmm.
Does that change the complexion or the interpretation?
It adds to it. It adds to it. For example, Saturn is at 24 Aquarius 56, let's say 25 Aquarius. When it comes to the midpoints, Saturn right now is hard aspecting. Now I'm looking at Saturn in the United States chart at this point. Thomas, can you follow? For those of you, most astrologers understand this. The midpoints are very sensitive. For example, right now in this eclipse, which is a focus point, it's a snapshot saying, hey, look at me, look at these. Right now, under this eclipse, Saturn is at the midpoint of our Venus and Saturn, which is very depressive as far as love and money are concerned. That's the old cookbook definition. The Venus-Saturn midpoint is disappointment in love, sorrow in love, suffering in love. Well, Venus also rules money. So Saturn in this eclipse, right at the midpoint of Venus and Saturn, is talking about the financial crisis that we are grappling with in the United States right now, trying to decide what the heck to do with interest rates and so on, inflation. Nobody can afford to rent a place anymore. Saturn right now in this eclipse chart is also at the midpoint of Neptune and Pluto, which absolutely has to do on the very deepest levels with a nation's and a people's religious and philosophical and spiritual beliefs. Now, this goes even further, Thomas. Neptune and Pluto midpoint can be on a collective level war and very destructive. Neptune and Pluto both can indicate atomic radiation, gas poisoning, all biological weapons, all of which are now being either used in the Ukraine or talked about being used. And Saturn at the midpoint of that is also threatening an event like we're talking about. The third midpoint it's at is the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint. And that has everything to do with governmental structures and governmental agencies. So we're talking about the executive branch, the legislative branch in Congress, and the judicial branch in the Supreme Court with the Saturn-Jupiter midpoint. And of course, all three of those midpoints I just named happen to be in hard aspect with the United States natal moon, the public, and women, among other things. So this is a big existential transformation that's going on in this country. And this one eclipse is not going to end it. It's going to continue. But that's, when you ask about these midpoints, that's how they work. If you look to see what planet are you talking about, in this case, Saturn, what's the nature of Saturn? And then what are these midpoints that it's currently hitting? And these midpoints have to be exact within about 1 degree in astrology. They can't have an orb of 6 degrees. So this is pretty specific. But again, because the eclipse is like a snapshot of a particular time and space, it's saying, pay attention to this, look at this, analyze this, think about this.
I know one thing that people react to with this is they say, come on, Robert, really? Is there that much wrapped up in that little wheel?
Yes, and more. And more.
And more, yeah. We had so much more.
Let me maybe close with this thought, because when we set up the eclipse this way in the natural wheel, which applies to everybody, the very first thing you notice is that Jupiter, which has just now entered Aries, it's at 1 degree, 0 minutes of Aries, and it's right on the first cusp in the natural wheel. And Jupiter absolutely has to do with hope, optimism, confidence. In what? In Aries, in the new, in the new, in the new. Aries is about the new. It's not about the old. So what we're seeing clearly in this chart with the focus on Pluto coming at the end of Capricorn, that's the old way of governing nations and governing the world, and it's not working. We're going to have to figure out something else. But Jupiter in Aries rising right now and focused by this eclipse is hope through the new. Everybody is looking for, and Venus is also in Aries. So everybody is looking for some new way of living together, cooperating. But I like this eclipse chart simply for the Jupiter-Venus positions in Aries.
Wow. Well, this has just been incredible. And thank you so much for such an in-depth analysis, thoughtful and informative. And if you're wondering, yes, Robert is available for readings. His website is rglasscock4site.com. And you can contact him there, but also to make it easier for you as well, we've put that link in the show notes. Thank you for listening to Old Soul, New Soul Astrology with Robert Glasscock. Back soon with another episode.